were thousands of weapons used in World War II, but none of them had quite the impact that the Tiger tank had. The Tiger tank was one of Germany's first heavy tanks, and they changed the way tanks were manufactured. The Germans opened up a new frontier for future tanks and influenced all the Allied forces to design and create better tanks so that they could have a chance against them. They revolutionized warfare for the Allied forces. The Panzer tank and the Tiger tank were Germany's two main tanks, but Panzer Is were mostly used in the First World War. Panzer IIs were regarded as platoon commanders' tanks. They were also employed to give fire support to the Panzer Is in combat with enemy tanks. However, by 1940 they had been outclassed and were soon relegated to the reconnaissance role. The Panzer II remained in frontline service until 1943, but was then employed on internal security duties in less active locations. The Germans were dismayed to learn that the T-34 and KV-1 Soviet tanks could not be destroyed by the Panzer III and Panzer IV models during Operation Barbarossa, which encouraged them to start manufacturing Tiger tanks.
Both Ferdinand Porsche and Henschel & Son constructed a prototype of the Tiger tank in 1937, but only after extensive testing to determine which prototype was best and easiest to produce in large quantities was the design by Henschel & Son picked. Porsche's design wasn't picked, but they nevertheless allowed him to give the tank its nickname, the Tiger tank. They may have started the design process in 1937, but they didn't start the production on them until 1942. They are being produced in Kassel, Germany, and Henschel & Son were the ones building the tanks. The tanks were built in 9 stages, otherwise known as talks. Each step took 6 hours each. Talk 1 was the process of moving the tank into the factory. In Talk 2 and 3, they would drill and machine holes for the suspension arms, drive sprockets, and final drives. During Talk 4, a turret ring was fixed onto a massive lathe. During Talks 5 and 6, they would install major internal components. Also during those steps, they would do the fitting of the road wheels, drive sprockets, and tracks. Talk 7 was when they would test drive the tanks, and if that went well, they would fit the final components in Talk 8. Lastly, during Talk 9, they would paint it and put on all of its finishing touches. Once it was finished, it would be loaded onto a railway wagon for delivery. The final assembly line had an average of 10 Tigers being built at one time. Total construction time was around 14 days. The Tiger tank's primary drawback was how long it took to construct and produce one. Not only that, but it required a lot of resources and money to produce as well. At the start of production, they would fabricate about 25 tanks each month. In 1944, the production rate went up to 104 tanks per month. Each tank took 300,000 man-hours to build. During their assembly, the city of Kassel was bombed 40 times by the Allies. It caused severe damage to Henschel & Son factories. Despite the killing and injury of a high percentage of the workers, production continued.
On the 29th of August 1942, 4 Tiger tanks were sent into the Battle of Leningrad. Even though the commander of the 502nd advised against deploying them because the terrain was unsuitable for the 56-ton tank, they did it anyways. During their first day of combat, all 4 of the tanks were knocked out, but the armor was not penetrated. Only 3 of the 4 tanks were operational by September 15th. After the failed attempt, training facilities and Tiger tactics were created for anyone who would drive a tank. The tanks made a huge impact in Russia. By the end of 1944, the Tiger had destroyed a huge amount of enemy equipment. One of the Tiger's most notable battles was the Battle of Normandy on July 18, 1944. Germany was stationed at Versailles when they were called to Normandy. The panzer divisions were sent in with Tigers to launch an armored counter-offense. These tanks were too few to really hinder the Allies. Nonetheless, actions such as those carried out by Michael Whitman marked the superiority of this tank. It's considered one of the best armored vehicles of the entire Second World War. The Tigers were used in the Battle of Kursk in 1943. This was the largest tank battle in history. They deployed 246 tanks, and only 6 were destroyed. They fought against the Soviets. The Soviet guns were ineffective against the Tiger tanks, unless at suicidal short ranges. Germany launched their attack, and at the beginning there was very little resistance. But the Germans soon overextended their position, and the Tigers bogged down in the wet marshes. After more than a week, the Germans were unable to circle the Soviets. So the Soviet commander launched a devastating counterattack and got their territory back. The Soviet tanks mostly burned, and about 1,600 of their tanks were destroyed. Most of the German tanks were recovered. 2 Tiger tanks were destroyed, 5 others disabled with track damage. The Soviets won the battle.
The Tiger tank was one of the most feared tanks for its time. It weighed about 57 tons and it had heavy armor that was barely penetrable. It could take about 227 hits by anti-tank rounds and 14 hits by 52mm shells. It was the first tank to have a steering wheel with hydraulic associates so it could be easily turned. The tank was designed to drive through 4 meters of water using a snorkel-type tube. It was equipped with several heavy guns. The main weapon was a 88mm KWK 43L71 high-velocity gun. There were 2 7.92mm machine guns and a 34 machine gun protected the Tiger tank from infantry attack. It carried a minimum of 80 rounds of armor piercings and high-explosive 88mm ammunition. The frontal armor of the Tiger tank was 150mm thick and sloped 50mm. The armor was sloped because if a shell were to hit the tank, it would be more likely to ricochet off. Even though the Tiger tank was one of the most fearful tanks, it still had its defects. The engine would frequently break down due to the engine being underpowered because of the size of the tank. The gearbox inside the tank would break constantly. The Tiger tank had to consume a lot of fuel, and the lack of fuel made it a problem towards the end of the war, which means that the Germans struggled with the limited range and mobility due to the amount of gas in the tank being so heavy. While the wide tracks were good for cross-country, the overlapping wheel design required constant heavy maintenance. It was very difficult for German facilities to create the amount of tanks needed. The success of the Tiger tank against its enemies had a great effect on Allied forces. It could knock out with ease any Allied tank at considerable range, and few British or American weapons could destroy it. The Tiger tanks intimidated the British because they couldn't get a good shot at them with their Churchill tanks unless they were at a suicidal range. On February 1, 1943, the British encountered and captured a Tiger tank and performed multiple tests on it to see how powerful it really was. They performed tests to see how powerful the guns were, and they used their own guns to see how strong the armor was. They would shoot shells fired from their own Churchill tanks, and the shells would simply bounce off. After experimenting on the tanks multiple times, the British found that the tank had a great gun platform and was extremely well protected from everything but their biggest guns. This influenced the Allied forces to design and produce better tanks strong enough to take on the Tiger tank.
The invention of the Tiger tank influenced the United States to manufacture a tank powerful enough to take on the Tiger tank. So they built the M4 Sherman tank, which was a huge improvement from the first ever working tank, Little Willie. More than 50,000 were produced, and it was used by almost all of the Allied forces. The Sherman tanks were the most powerful tanks that the Allied forces used, but they didn't even compare to the Tiger tank. The Tiger could hold up a dozen Sherman tanks, but they produced Sherman tanks so rapidly and efficiently compared to the Tiger tank that they easily outnumbered them. Majority of the Tiger tanks were either captured or destroyed in battle, but out of the 1,837 that were built, only 7 remain, and out of the 7, only 1 is still in working condition. It is located at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England. The new tanks were perfect for soldiers in the war, but they were very expensive. When Germany went into war, they needed money to pay for the cost of equipment, which raised taxes and made the lower class population struggle because they didn't have very much money. Overall, the Tiger tank was a very powerful advanced weapon with a few minor defects. Out of all the tanks used in World War II, Germany set a new standard for what heavy tanks should be like. Despite their downfall against the Allies, Germany had a very destructive tank that could do a lot of damage. These tanks were a frontier for the tanks we have today, and we might not have ever designed heavy tanks as powerful as they are now without the Tiger tank's influence.